Hello and welcome to today's video. Today we have some important news out of the state of North Carolina, where Democrat Willie Nickel, the only other Democrat in the race for Senate at this time, has officially suspended his campaign and has endorsed Democrat former Governor Roy Cooper in the North Carolina Senate race. Now this has some very important ramifications for 2026, seeing as Roy Cooper just yesterday announced he was running for this Senate race. With him now in the race, the Democrats have been rallying behind Cooper as the prospective Democratic candidate. And I did a video yesterday going over Roy Cooper and the strengths he brings as a candidate to this race, namely his election history in North Carolina going back to the year 2000 and his very impressive governor wins in 2016 and 2020, and why Roy Cooper is such a strong candidate. Willie Nickel, who's the only other Democrat in this race, who's a former U.S. representative from North Carolina's 13th district from 2023 to 2025, he was looked at, if Roy Cooper decided not to run, as the likely Democratic candidate. But with Cooper in the race, it's very clear that Cooper was going to be the Democratic nominee. Willie Nickel withdraws from this race and now officially endorses Cooper. And this is in not a long list, but a pretty notable list of Democrats that have been shoring up support for Cooper now. He has the endorsement of Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Chuck Schumer, now Willie Nickel, Deborah Ross, Jeff Jackson, Josh Stein, and Anderson Clayton. All very high notable Democrats in their own regards. So Roy Cooper is clearly going to be the Democratic candidate in 2026, and Willie Nickel dropping out of the race really just summarizes that or cements that and says that Roy Cooper will be the Democratic candidate. The Republican side, things are a little bit more wide open as we wait for the official announcement from RNC Chair Michael Whatley, who's expected to be in the race by August 3rd, 2025, with the backing of President Trump. We've also seen some very top Trump allies already rule out running, like Pat Harrigan, Richard Hudson, Greg Murphy, Mark Robinson, Laura Trump, Mark Walker, all of which arguably could get the endorsement of President Trump but have declined running. Very strong indications that Michael Whatley will be the Republican candidate and have the backing of President Trump. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the prior video I've done, if you have not checked that out, I do encourage you to check that video out after this one, as I do go more in depth on North Carolina and how things stand on this race. But right now, this is going to be one of the closest races in 2026. Inside Elections, Cook Political Report, and Sabbath Crystal Ball are three top political prediction websites. They all have this race listed as a toss-up. Tom Tillis, the Republican senator who is deciding not to run for re-election in the early polling, showed that Roy Cooper was leading him by around 2 to 3%, sometimes even 4%, depending on the poll. Laura Trump, when she was considering running, Laura Trump versus Roy Cooper showed a poll that Roy Cooper was leading by 2 points. If you're unfamiliar with Roy Cooper and his election history in North Carolina, the most notable election was back in 2020, where he won against the Republican Dan Forest by about 4.5%. And then in 2016, he defeated then Republican Governor Pat McCrory by 0.22%. So those are both of Cooper's governor elections. And those are very notable because at the presidential level, Roy Cooper on the same ballot when Donald Trump won the state of North Carolina by 1.3% in 2020, and when Trump won the state by 3.7% in 2016, Cooper was able to win in both instances. Now, this is going to be important to talk about for 2026, as 2026 is a midterm election. Typically, midterm elections go the opposite way of the incumbent party in the White House and in control of the government. And in this case, the Republicans hold the majority in the Senate and the House and control of the White House. So based on historical precedent, Democrats are more expected to be in for a very strong night than the Republicans would be. It doesn't always 100% go the way that's expected. For instance, in 2022, Republicans were supposed to have a very big night. It ended up being more of like kind of a 50-50 night where the Republicans did very well in some parts on the Senate and the House side of things, and Democrats did well in some areas. So it's not always 100% sure going to go that way. But based on historical precedent, most of the time, the Democrats should be in for a very good night in 2026. Now, when looking at the Senate map for 2026 right now, I have Republicans favored in 52 Senate seats, Democrats 45, with 3 seats currently listed as toss-up, North Carolina being one of these seats. Now, based on this current map, Republicans already do have a majority in the U.S. Senate. You need 50 Senate seats to have the majority, with the Vice President breaking the tie, or 51 Senate seats without the Vice President. And the Republicans, obviously having Republican Vice President J.D. Vance, only would need 50 Senate seats to have the majority. So the Republicans are in a very advantageous situation on this 2026 Senate map. 3 of the toss-up seats, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, though they're all very close competitive states, they did all vote for Donald Trump in 2024 not too long ago. The only Republican senator that is up in a state that Kamala Harris won was Susan Collins in the state of Maine. And there's some interesting news coming out of Maine about Governor Janet Mills potentially entering that race or not. That I'll be doing in a future video as well. But technically, on paper, the only state that Kamala Harris won of all these senators would be the state of Maine. So just going off of that alone, and again, this is not really how it works, but just going off that alone, that would only guarantee the Democrats about 1 win on the Senate map if that were to be the case. If you're going off of 2024, Republicans would win all 3 of these, and it would get the Republicans a net gain of 1 seat. However, as we know, each election cycle is different, and candidates in each race is different. So not always necessarily how things are going to go. But it's interesting Republicans do already start out with a very strong possibility of winning the Senate. Now, it is worth noting Democrats are trying to expand the map by not only going after Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, and Maine, but Democrats are also trying to target Ohio, Iowa, Nebraska, and Texas as the most notable places where they're trying to expand the map and get either Democrats or, in Nebraska's case, independent Dan Osborne elected to the Senate to give the Democrats a strong chance at doing so. However, at this point in time, even given the national environment, which I'm expecting to be more Democratic friendly, I think the Republicans are more likely than not going to hold on to those Senate seats in those 4 states. So North Carolina, Michigan, and Georgia are going to be the 3 Senate seats that get the most amount of attention, with some potential in Maine if Janet Mills runs against Susan Collins. That could change things as well. How North Carolina goes right now, well, it's changed a little bit over the last few months, starting out for Thom Tillis versus Willie Nickel. I think that race started out around a tilt Republican win for Tillis very narrowly. In a generic Republican versus Willie Nickel, I think it would probably start out in the lean Republican category, but Roy Cooper is a very strong, unique candidate. Now that Roy Cooper's in this race, it's likely going to be Roy Cooper versus Michael Whatley. I think this is going to be a very close, expensive Senate race that's probably going to break some records for the most expensive Senate race in the history of the United States. If it doesn't, Georgia may break those records, but I think one of the two will become the most expensive Senate race in the history of the United States, and which party wins this Senate race could be very important for a lot of reasons. One that doesn't often get talked about, actually, could be the House elections in 2026, where there's one House race in particular in 2024 that was very close, which was North Carolina's 1st district with Democrat Don Davis. Now, he did win by 1.7%. The district, overall, according to the Cook Political Voting Index, is Republican +1, though. If the Republicans had a very amazing night in 2026 and won the Senate race by a decent margin, it's possible this district could maybe flip to the Republicans. Now, it doesn't always happen that way, but typically very strong nights for one party could lead to a potential avenue like that where that could happen. However, we also saw a semi-competitive race in North Carolina 11, but mainly this district would be one to watch for. If Roy Cooper were to run a very good race and win by a much larger margin than expected, down-ballot effects could happen where maybe that guarantees that district safe for the Democrats. Maybe the Democrats make more inroads in other districts, but cementing a very close House seat on that regard. These things don't really get talked about too much when you talk about Senate races, how important of a role they could play down-ballot on House races as well. But on just the Senate side of things, it's also very important, as if Roy Cooper wins, this would be a Democratic flip going from red to blue and would make President Trump and the Republicans passing Trump's agenda a little bit harder in the U.S. Senate. And then if Democrats were to make gains in like a state, Maine, for instance, which is also held by a Republican right now, if Susan Collins were to lose, this would cut the Republicans' majority only down to 51. Where if Lisa Murkowski in Alaska decides to vote no on a bill, that would make it 50-50, and it would really hurt the Republicans' chances at getting that bill done. Otherwise, no other Republican could disagree on a bill. So it would be really, really fascinating to see how that goes down. Now, obviously, we're not going to know for a while. We're only in 2025, towards the end of July. We're not going to know about 2026 for a little bit ways down the road, but at very least, North Carolina plays a very important role in determining not just Senate control, but also how much of a margin Republicans have going into 2026. And Roy Cooper gives the Democrats a strong chance at winning this Senate race. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below telling me your thoughts and any other videos you'd like to see me cover. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're talking about the 2026 Senate race in the state of Maine and the possibility of the Democratic governor of the state of Maine, Janet Mills, potentially running for Senate in 2026. Now this article from the Bangor Daily News just details how things are currently going right now. The Democratic governor essentially said that her national profile has risen since her See You in Court remark with President Trump. Though at 77 years old, Mills is still considering a run for 2026, but has not given any indication if she's leaning one way or the other at this time, as Democrats thus far have not been able to field a very well-known and well-notable candidate in the state of Maine to run against Susan Collins. So just to give you some quick backstory on this race, obviously this is Republican Senator Susan Collins. Interestingly, she is the only Republican senator representing a state that Kamala Harris won in the 2024 presidential election. And just to give you an idea of how that went, Maine in 2024 statewide voted for Kamala Harris by about 6.9%, if you want to round up to 7 points. That would be a likely Democratic state. So obviously Susan Collins' Republican Senate seat in the likely Democratic state of Maine is a top target for national Democrats. And when you look at the Senate map right now, I currently have it 52 for the Republicans, 45 for the Democrats, with 3 seats in Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia as toss-up. Maine I currently have as leading Republican for Susan Collins. Now, there's a few reasons for this. One being she is a Republican incumbent that showed in 2020 she can win very tough elections in very tough years for the Republicans. That's a very key reason. Another key reason is the Democrats have yet to field a very strong candidate to go up against her. And this isn't just my opinion. This is a lot of political analysts saying this, both Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated independents and such, have said the Democrats so far have failed to yield a prominent challenger versus Collins. And like we saw with Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, defeating an incumbent is not an easy thing to do. In 2024, Bob Casey narrowly lost his Senate race re-election to Republican Dave McCormick by a very narrow margin of 0.22%. So defeating an incumbent, it is possible, but it is very, very difficult. There was also a close call in Wisconsin where Tammy Baldwin narrowly defeated Republican Eric Hovde by 0.85%. But just because that happened in 2024 does not mean it could not happen in 2026. Because we did see Republicans beat Democrat John Tester in Montana by about 7 points, and Republican Bernie Moreno defeat Democrat Sherrod Brown in Ohio. But these are 2 states that were more favorable for the Republicans. Montana, I would argue, is a safe Republican state. Ohio is more of a likely Republican state, and both of the Democratic incumbents representing states that Donald Trump won, the Democrats lost to the Republican candidates. Maine, I would argue, fits more into the Ohio and Montana argument than does the state of Pennsylvania. So really it would come down to 2 very important aspects. Do the people in the state of Maine, do they like Susan Collins enough to A, give her another vote in 2026, and B, given that Maine's more of a likely Democratic state, do the Democrats run a strong enough candidate to defeat Susan Collins in 2026? Because back in 2020, Susan Collins ended up winning by 8.6% against Democrat Sarah Gideon. And it is very important to note that for Senate and House elections in the state of Maine, ranked choice voting does take place. Now, ranked choice voting means you must break 50% of the vote on the first round of voting. If not, then it goes to the ranked choice voting process, where it essentially goes round by round until there's only 2 candidates left and one breaks 50% of the vote if it takes that long. Just to give you an idea of what this looked like, this actually happened in the House race in 2024 between Democrat Jared Golden and Republican Austin Thurl. On election day, I believe it was something like Jared Golden got 49.4%, Austin Thurl got 49.1%. No candidate broke 50%, so it had to go to the ranked choice voting recount or process on December 4th. And what ended up happening that was Jared Golden got up to 50.3% once the third-party votes were taken away and added to the candidates, and then Austin Thurl got 49.7%. So for Susan Collins to lose in 2026, it's possible a Democrat could win outright, but given how she ran in 2020, getting 51% of the vote, I would argue it's more likely the Democrats would have to win on ranked choice voting. However, it didn't look like always that in 2020 Susan Collins was going to defeat Sarah Gideon. When you go to the general election here, some political predictors actually had this race going to the Democrats. Cook Politico had it as a toss-up, but Inside Elections and Sabato's Crystal Ball both had it as flipping to the Democrats, giving the Democrats the win. And these are 2 very highly reputable political prediction websites. And it wasn't just that, but the polling on this race also showed that Democrat Sarah Gideon had an advantage over Susan Collins heading into this race. Now, on Real Clear Politics and on 270 to Win, it should be worth noting there was still a very large amount of other or undecided vote left in these races. So whenever there's a large amount of third-party vote, like 48.5 to 42, there's always a big asterisk on this because that could go one of two ways. That could go all for one candidate, all for the other, or it could end up being split and it really doesn't change things too much. In this situation, Susan Collins was able to really get a lot of that undecided vote remaining and ended up making a very, very big win where she won by a likely Republican margin. Will that happen in 2026? That remains to be seen. Because in 2020, there was obviously a higher voting turnout than midterm elections usually are. So in 2026, it could be voters that come out to vote are only the voters that are very motivated and energized to get out to vote. Voter turnout will be lower than it was in 2020. Now, 2026 is a midterm that's going to take place during President Trump's second term when the Republicans currently hold control of the executive branch and the legislative branch as well. So this could be an election environment that actually benefits the Democrats. But the Democrats still have a very big problem in Maine. Yes, it is a likely Democratic state, but they're also going to have to take down a Republican incumbent that won a tough election back in 2020. And no offense to any of the Democrats already in this race, but they need a Democrat, in my opinion, one that's well-known statewide, one that can raise a lot of money, and one that can make a very considerable argument to Susan Collins to actually win. It's possible any one of these three Democrats could win against Susan Collins, but it's a lot less of a sure bet than if they have a very strong, well-known, high-name ID candidate. Because taking down someone like Susan Collins, who Democrats are going to try and tire to President Trump as much as possible, but her voting record suggests she's far more likely to break with President Trump in a lot of instances compared to other Republican senators, that's going to appeal to a lot of independent voters in the state of Maine. Maine, despite being a likely Democratic state, has a lot of voters that are independents, and even some Democrats that are willing to vote for Republicans, which is how Susan Collins has been able to survive so far. So the prospect of the Democrats not having a strong candidate could be very worrisome for them and hoping to flip this seat. However, Janet Mills, the governor of Maine, who is term limited and cannot seek re-election in 2026, the prospects of her running would give the Democrats, at very least, a well-known name statewide. Now, there are a few things here that could potentially knock Janet Mills' candidacy. One being, I believe she is 77 years old, and after serving 2 terms as governor of Maine, it's possible she's decided she's had enough of public service and would maybe want a little time off and not want to run for this race. And if she decided to make that decision, I mean, really, who could blame her? But if she were to run against Susan Collins, being the governor of the state of Maine for 2 terms at very least, gives her a certain amount of electability and name notoriety in making this a competitive state. I'm not going to make the comparison of the governor of Maine to Roy Cooper, the former governor of North Carolina, because I do think Roy Cooper is a very special candidate in North Carolina that I don't think Janet Mills is on the same level of. But I do think of all the potential Democratic candidates in Maine, I think Janet Mills does give the best possible chance for Democrats at flipping this seat. However, if Mills does not run, Aaron Frey, the Maine Attorney General is also a pretty high-profile office. Maybe he can make that race competitive. Ryan Fechtow, the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, also would likely be a formidable candidate. But I think it starts out in terms of like a tier list of who's the strongest candidate going down. I think Janet Mills starts out as the strongest. Now, even if Janet Mills is the Democrat, I'm not saying I guarantee this will be a Democratic flip. Because after 2020, I think Susan Collins, even though she did have poor approval ratings in 2020 and arguably still does have poor approval ratings in 2026, she showed she was able to win a tough election back then. But when I talk about governors or former governors running for Senate, I often say it doesn't work because they're running in states that are not the majority party in the state. For instance, in 2018, when Phil Bredesen, the Democratic governor once upon a time in Tennessee, ran for Senate, he lost to the Republican Marsha Blackburn by a smaller margin, but the Democrat Party does not have as much of a stranglehold in Tennessee as the Republicans do. But Rick Scott, the Republican governor, won against Democratic Senator Bill Nelson in Florida. Florida at this time was about a 50-50 state, and Scott was able to beat Nelson. Maine, however, is a likely Democratic state. So when it comes to running for Senate, the Democratic governor would be running against a Republican incumbent, but in a state that favors the Democrats more than it would favor the Republicans. So when you take that into account, it would look more like Montana with Jon Tester losing to Tim Sheehy, the challenger, where the Republican Party is more prominent than the Democrats, or Ohio, where Sherrod Brown lost to Bernie Moreno in a state that's more Republican-friendly for the Democratic incumbent. I think you can make a very similar argument to Janet Mills or Susan Collins, maybe being like in Ohio, more so than in Montana. I don't think Susan Collins would lose by 7 points, but a lean win for the Democrat Janet Mills over the Republican Susan Collins, at very least, I think is very possible for 2026 if she were to decide to run. But that's the big domino here. Does Janet Mills actually decide to run? Right now, I think personally, this is just my opinion. I don't have any basis on this. This is what my own personal speculation is. I think Janet Mills, after serving 2 terms of governor, probably does not want to run for Senate. As I mentioned, she is 77 years old, and she likely would probably want to just leave politics after this. Maybe go around, do speaking events, but likely wouldn't want to be a senator, for instance. But I think national Democrats like Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand, who are in charge of trying to get more Democrats elected, are probably speaking to her a lot, saying that she's the strongest possible candidate at flipping this race blue. Or possibly even making the argument she may be the only Democrat at this point that can flip the Senate race from red to blue. It's possible Aaron Frey or Ryan Fechtow or Kathy Breen or any of these other Democrats could win given the right national election environment, but Janet Mills may be the most formidable Democrat in this race. So they could be making that argument. Now, on the Senate map, which as I mentioned earlier in the video, Republicans currently have 52 Senate seats, Democrats have 45. 3 Senate races right now are Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, all 3 of which are currently toss-ups in my latest rankings. Maine, I currently have as lean Republican. Now, if Janet Mills were to enter this race, I think at very least, and being the most favorable for Collins, I would move this race towards tilt Republican. I do think Susan Collins would still have a little bit of an edge until more polling data came out and we get more of an idea of the national environment for 2026. But if Maine moved to the toss-up category, the Democrats had a legitimate chance at flipping the seat, well then the Republicans would only be guaranteed about 51 Senate seats. Even though Democrats could win all of these seats, it would get them to 49. The Republicans would still hold the majority in the U.S. Senate. The Republican majority would be a lot smaller than it is now. Going from 53 to 51 is actually very significant because Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, often breaks with President Trump on a lot of key Senate votes. Then it would be a 50-50 Senate where Vice President Vance would have to break the tie on pretty much every single Senate vote. And if one more Republican senator decided they don't feel like voting for that respective bill, the bill's essentially dead on arrival. So Maine could play a very important role, if not even flipping the Senate for the Democrats in 2026, at limiting how much Republican bills are able to possibly pass in the next Senate after the 2026 midterm elections. And then you talk about 2028, where the Senate may actually be possible at flipping towards the Democrats, as there'll be 2 Republican senators up in Wisconsin with Republican Senator Ron Johnson and North Carolina Senator Ted Budd that are going to be 2 top targets for the Democrats in 2028. If the Democrats in a 51-49 Senate, if the Democrats win the White House and win one of these seats, Democrats technically have control of the Senate. Even if Republicans were to hold White House control, if the Democrats flip these 2 Senate seats, then Democrats would have control. So this Senate seat in Maine with Susan Collins, if the Democrats could actually flip it and get a strong candidate to flip this Senate race, really gives the Democrats very strong prospects for not just 2026, but also for 2028. Whereas, if Maine were to stay for Susan Collins to stay in the Republican category, that would get Republicans to 52. It would help the Republicans in the short term, but also looking at the Senate map for 2028 as well. If Republicans could hold on in North Carolina, that would pretty much guarantee the Republicans holding on to the Senate for another 2 years as well. So Maine could actually play a very important role here, and that's why Democrats are taking this race very seriously. The question will be, can the Democrats get a strong enough candidate to run? I think Janet Mills is probably the strongest candidate. Even if she were to run, I don't think it's a guarantee that she would win. But in a state that did vote for Kamala Harris, at very least, you have to have the conversation about a candidate like Janet Mills putting up a very tough campaign and maybe be able to upset Susan Collins in the same way Bernie Moreno was able to upset Sherrod Brown in 2024. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found this interesting. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts about this video and about this potential news and what you think about the argument that I laid out. Also, if you really enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe as I post multiple videos every single day that you are not going to want to miss. That'll do it for today's video. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today I'm talking about the state of Pennsylvania in the 2026 governor election, where 2022 Republican nominee Doug Mastriano is reportedly considering a run for governor again in 2026. And this would be, and I cannot understate this enough, a absolute diabolical, catastrophic blow for the Republicans if Doug Mastriano was the Republican nominee again in 2026. And when you look at 2022, you may remember the governor election where Democrat Josh Shapiro, who I believe was the Attorney General of Pennsylvania at the time, faced off against Doug Mastriano. Doug Mastriano was a very flawed, scandal-plagued candidate who lost to Josh Shapiro by 14.8% in this race. Now, some of this could be attributed to Josh Shapiro being a very strong Democratic candidate, and I do think that is the case, that Shapiro was a very strong Democratic candidate without any big notable scandals, but I think it's also a part that Mastriano was a very flawed Republican candidate as well. Regardless, Shapiro won by 14.8%, which, if you're familiar with the rankings here, of 1 or under being tilt, 1 to 5 being lean, 5 to 15 being likely, and then 15 or above being safe, was only 0.2% away from being a safe Democratic win in Pennsylvania in 2022. When on the same ballot, the Senate race, you may remember, John Fetterman won against Republican Dr. Oz by 4.9%. So even though Fetterman won by a pretty large margin as well, it was still about 10 points better for the Republicans than the governor's race. Doug Mastriano is not a good candidate for the Republicans to run in Pennsylvania. But there's a few things going on here. For one, talking about the 2026 governor's race in Pennsylvania, you can look at the governor map, and right now I have the race currently starting as likely Democratic, where I think Shapiro will win in between that 5 and 15% threshold. If it's Mastriano versus Shapiro again, I have 100% no doubt moving Pennsylvania into the safe Democratic category. I'm already pretty close to moving Pennsylvania to safe Democratic, but if it's Mastriano versus Shapiro, I'm definitely making it safe. But there's a few things happening here. For one, the Republicans don't really have a strong candidate they could run against Shapiro, and a large part of that is Shapiro, as the incumbent governor, has pretty strong and pretty high approval ratings, and he's going to be reelected without much of a doubt in 2026. This is also as he eyes a potential presidential run in 2028, and as he was under VP consideration for Kamala Harris's campaign in 2024. Now, the Republicans, 3 of which who have expressed interest, are Stacey Garrity, the Pennsylvania state treasurer, Scott Martin, a state senator, and now Doug Mastriano. President Trump did ask Dan Muser, the U.S. representative from the 9th District, to run for this race, and if he did, President Trump already promised him his endorsement. But Muser, seeing the writing on the wall here, knew he would probably not win this election and decided to run for re-election to his very safe Republican House seat, where he should not have much of a problem at holding on there. That's also a reality that the Republican is probably not going to beat Josh Shapiro in this election. But running Doug Mastriano, if he became the Republican nominee, could make a bad situation for the Republicans potentially even worse in 2026. Now, just to get things out of the way, I don't think Doug Mastriano would get the endorsement of several notable Republicans in this race. I don't think President Trump would endorse him. I don't think the state GOP in Pennsylvania would endorse him. In fact, there are some reports that if Mastriano and Stacey Garrity both jump in the race, that the Pennsylvania GOP may unite around Stacey Garrity and try and get her the nomination to ensure that Doug Mastriano does not get it. Maybe President Trump decides to endorse her as well to avoid that disaster of Mastriano being the Republican nominee. And I keep talking about this. What kind of disaster could it be? Well, currently it's listed as likely Democratic from the Cook Political Report, Sablo Crystal Ball, and Race to the White House. Inside Elections has it as a battleground, but the consensus on this race is it's going to be a very big win for Josh Shapiro. But Pennsylvania also has some very important House races up in 2026 as well. And in 2024, there were 3 House races that came very, very close to going Democratic, but the Republicans won. Pennsylvania 10, where Republican Scott Perry won by 1.3%. Pennsylvania 7, where Republican Ryan McKenzie won by 1 point. And Pennsylvania 8, where Republican Rob Bresnahan won by 1.6%. And just again, it's important to note, these 3 House races all went red on the same ballot in 2024 when President Trump was at the top of the ticket and won Pennsylvania by 1.7% against Democrat Kamala Harris. It's also in the same election when statewide, Republican Dave McCormick was able to defeat Democratic incumbent Senator Bob Casey who has been in the Senate for a very long time now, he was able to beat him by 0.22%. So in terms of Pennsylvania, 2024 could really not get a better night for the Republicans in that race. 2026 is going to be a much different situation, where in 2022, Josh Shapiro won by 14.8%. As I mentioned, the Senate race in 2022, John Fetterman won it by 4.9%. And the House races in 2022 in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania 10 for Scott Perry was more Republican. It was 7.7%. But in these two House races in Pennsylvania 7, the Democrat Wild defeated the Republican by about 2 points. And Pennsylvania 8, Cartwright, the Democrat, won by 2.4. So again, in 2024, in the great night for the Republicans, these three districts were all decided by around 1.5% or under, with Republicans doing very well. What if Democrats have a very strong night in Pennsylvania again in 2026, as is expected, but with Doug Mastriano being the Republican candidate, what if Republican voter turnout is even lower than it was in 2022, or on par than it was in 2022? Well, then in that situation, you could see some very notable flips here in Pennsylvania 8, Pennsylvania 7, and Pennsylvania 10. Now, the overall House vote in 2024 nationally was about Republican plus, I believe it was 2.8 it ended up being. So right now, the current polling for 2026 is not anywhere near Republican plus 2.8. It's actually a Democrat plus 2.9, which would be almost about a 4-point flip of what it currently was in 2024. Just to show you what a 4-point flip would look like here, if we were to shift by about 4 points, what would happen to these districts? All three of which would flip to the Democrats. So nationally, the Republicans in these districts are already facing a very tough situation going into 2026, with the Democrats expected to do much better in the House in 2026 than they did in 2024. Doug Mastriano being at the top of the ticket for the Republicans in a governor's race the Republicans know is not going to be very competitive may make a bad situation for the Republicans potentially even worse. I don't think this district right here is going to go to the Democrats, but it may almost guarantee the Democrats these three districts in a good night for the Democrats with Doug Mastriano leading the ticket. So not only would Mastriano being the Republican nominee for governor essentially take the Republicans out of having any possibility at flipping this race, I don't think the Republicans have a strong chance at winning the governor's race anyway, but it could have very significant down ballot effects on the U.S. House level in these three very important House districts. It would also have an effect on the State House and State Senate as well in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Those could also be very important wins for the Democrats. But at the federal level, these three U.S. House districts could go for the Democrats because a very bad Republican is leading the ticket. Now, the good news for the Republicans is they could avoid this by not having Doug Mastriano be the Republican nominee. They could have Stacey Garrity or Scott Martin be the Republican nominee. But even still, it's probably not going to stop the situation of Josh Shapiro winning re-election and these three House districts being very important to watch for in 2026 anyway, because these three districts are all going to be very close and may flip no matter what. But the Republicans should try their best to minimize the damage as much as possible, and running Doug Mastriano would not be a very good way at trying to do that. So again, just to do a quick recap here, Pennsylvania I currently have as likely Democratic for Josh Shapiro. If Doug Mastriano becomes the Democratic nominee, without a doubt, Pennsylvania moves to safe Democratic. And just to give you an idea, this isn't unprecedented in Pennsylvania where Democrats win the governor's races by a lot. Josh Shapiro won by 14.8% in 2022. Back in 2018, the Democrat Tom Wolf won by 17 points. And in 2014, the Democrat Tom Wolf defeated the Republican Governor Corbett by 9.9%. So since 2014, the Democrats have won the governor's race in Pennsylvania by either a likely or a safe Democratic margin. So that certainly could happen again in 2026 if you're like, a Democrat would never win by more than 15 points in Pennsylvania. Just in the last 10 years or so, that has happened in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you had. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts and any other comments you have about this video or other videos you'd like to see me cover. That's going to do it. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.